So today I'm going to be talking about clay prep and wedging, all of the steps that I take in preparation for throwing. So the first thing I do is I like to weigh out my clay. Depending on what form I'm making, I normally do a batch, so I would weigh it out all at once. And for example of that, I do small mugs and larger mugs, and they each have their own weight. So the smaller ones are 12 ounces, the larger ones are about a pound. And all of my tumblers are a pound as well, so depending on what I'm making, I'll just weigh it all out. And I like to weigh out my clay to help maintain uniformity, make sure that all of the heights will be close to the same thing. I know I don't get them to be all identical or anything like that, but like weighing it out will give you like a head start on trying to get there. And I know that with different clay bodies, like I use either Helios, which is a porcelain, or Little Loafers, which is a stoneware. Depending on like which one I'm using, those weights might change a little bit. I'm able to use a little bit less of the stoneware to give me the same result as I get with the Helios. I find it easier throwing wise to work with stoneware. Sometimes Helios still gives me a little bit of issues, so I use a little bit more clay to kind of buffer that. And with porcelain, when I like first start to like weigh it out fresh out of the bag, I like to drop that bag of clay on the floor a few times, which sounds a little bit weird, but it does help kind of get the clay moving in the same direction, or like the particles in the same direction. It'll loosen it up a little bit, and I know that for me personally, I found like the bottom of the bag of Helios is a lot firmer than the top or the sides of it, so by dropping it, it will kind of start to homogenize the bag. And with any clay body, kind of from start to finish, I like to wedge it up before I start to throw. And wedging is really important, especially if you're using reclaimed clay, which I try to avoid at all costs, but you know, sometimes it has to happen. And the purpose of wedging is to kind of start homogenizing that clay. If you are using reclaim, it will help get all of those air bubbles out. With fresh clay, I like to wedge it up to get everything just moving the same direction. Homogenize, like the same purpose is true, but with reclaim it's definitely a little bit more important. I like to use like the ram head method. That's how I was taught, and I'll show you that in just a second. But the purpose of wedging, just to make that a little bit more clear, is like it makes it more pliable, easier to work with. It will start getting all of those particles moving in that same circular motion that you will have on your wheel. Yeah, so I'm gonna alter this camera and I will show you how to wedge. Alright, so for wedging, I usually start off, or for cutting the clay, I usually start off with a fresh bag. I'll take my wire cutters, wrap it around the back, and cut off about 2 inches of clay, 1.5-ish. And then I like to just cut it into 4, and that will give me like a good starting point for measuring it out. So I have a food scale, or a small little digital scale here, and I just kind of estimate what this is. So this is about 12 ounces, which is what I use for my smallest mug, so I'll stick with that. And I like to do it in a batch, so I'm going to go ahead and weigh out all of them. And so I'm right on point. So after you do this for a while, you can kind of estimate and get pretty close. So these are all 12 ounces. And that's what's going to result in a piece like this size for me. So to wedge it up, I've seen a lot of people, or like when I first started, I would just kind of pat down the edges and start with more of like a little like hockey puck shape. Over time, I've found it to be a lot more helpful to just go ahead and wedge it out. So I like to have it kind of standing straight up and then using the like insides of my palms on either side of the piece and press forward. And that will kind of get everything moving forward. And then I just keep going back up and repeating this motion. It's important to have like the sides of your palms gripping either side of your clay like this. And then you're able to just keep going. And when I was taught, I was told to kind of wedge close to 20-ish times. 21 was like the magic number. I've heard a lot of people going more than that, less than that. Kind of up to you, depending on like what you find is best. But I go around 20-ish times. It'll kind of depend on like the size of the piece too. So if, for like a smaller piece like this, like what's going to be a mug. I won't have to wedge as much as like if I'm doing like a larger bowl or something, like anything like that's more like 5 pounds and up, I would want to wedge it more. But when I'm done wedging, I kind of roll it up into like a little cone, and then I pat down the edge on the on my table so that it rounds out the bottom. And to show you that again, you start off with the clay just kind of flat up, and then taking it and pressing it down, keeping your palms wrapped around the sides. And I'm just pushing that clay down, bringing it back up, and repeating that motion. And you get this little ram's head is like the goal. With smaller piece of clay, you can't really tell like the true like ram's head. When you use larger amount, it's really clear. But you see like the spiral that it creates here, and if you get like a spiral on the bottom too, that's kind of what you're looking for. And then I like to use both of my hands, kind of round out the bottom of that piece. It smooths out the bottom. I like to start throwing with a cone shape like how this is, but if you wanted it to be more rounded, you can just pat down those edges, and then you're done. So then you would be ready to throw.